The Next Chapter with Prim Siripipat is a production of iHeartRadio. Hey everybody, it's Prim. Welcome to The Next Chapter, presented by Baron Davis and Slick Studios. This week's guest is former NFL and Ohio State running back and current college football analyst, Robert Smith. Robert was born and raised in Ohio. In high school, he was the first player to win Ohio's Mr. Football Award, not once, but twice. And after drawing interest from a number of football programs, including Miami, USC, and UCLA, he chose to take his talents to Ohio State, where he played football for 2 years and ran track for 1 year. He ended up leaving the Buckeyes early to pursue a professional football career. He was drafted by the Minnesota Vikings with the 21st overall pick in 1993, where he go on to have an 8-year NFL career and become a 2-time Pro Bowler. He actually still holds the all-time NFL record for average yards per touchdown run, a whopping 27.2 yards per TD run, and he remains second behind Adrian Peterson on the Vikings' all-time career rushing yard list with 6,818 yards and 32 TDs. Wow. There's no question his athletic achievements are impressive. But as we have seen and heard over the course of this show, that's only just one part of any athlete's story. In my interview with Robert, we talk about the role football played in lifting him out of some dark times during his troubled childhood. And we also talk about his battle with addiction and how he was able to hide his issues as a high-functioning alcoholic, including his time in the NFL. And we also discuss how the birth of his son was a turning point towards sobriety for him. Robert and I have known each other for a number of years now, and we had a little catching up to do at the beginning of our conversation. So we fast forward to Robert talking about how his childhood laid the foundation for many of his struggles, many of which involved alcohol. What I like about the podcast format is that I'm able to sit here with somebody and talk about whatever it is and dive into their personal journey for a whole hour, sometimes 2 hours if we really wanted to, uninterrupted. And the pieces that have been about you, there's a lot of articles, there are some pods, obviously, in different interviews. You appeared on First Take and all that other stuff in 2013. But, I feel like with articles, they are told through somebody else's words. And I think that's what's exciting about the podcast format, because I want to hear everything about your story and your childhood and everything else in your words and living through that. And so I'm curious, with that in mind, what do you think is one part of your story or your journey that people don't ask you enough about, or they forget to ask, that's been really important?
I think the way that I grew up, I think people assume if you talk a certain way that you had a certain background or a certain upbringing, and I think that my father was an addict. He was a drug dealer, violent drug dealer. Actually, was involved in a number of shootings and actually served some time in jail for killing people. And it was really chaotic growing up in that kind of environment. I remember the first time I had an older brother who passed away in 2017. But the first time that my father was involved with the shooting, my brother and I were out in front playing in front of the house, and my father pulls up in the car and he gets out, and he's hunched over and can see that he's bleeding, and he runs into the house and comes out with my mother, and they just drive off. And it's like, what's this? What's going on? Like we just had no idea. And there was a cover story. My mother told us that my father owned a game room, like a video game room. So this is early '80s. So just when these game rooms are starting to develop and grow. and seemed like a good cover story. We were counting money for him, and we had no idea. It was like, well, we're counting a lot of money, but we don't seem to have any of it ourselves. And he seemed to always be looking for it, so it was a bit strange. And the second time we were over a friend's house. Second time he was involved in a shooting, and this time it was really bad. And as I said, killed a couple of people and was in and out of jail for a number of years. So it was a really chaotic upbringing. My mother did the best that she could, and unfortunately, my mother passed away actually right after I left ESPN back in 2016. So, but she did what she could, and she struggled. It was very difficult on her, and she dealt with her own problems with addiction. And certainly the situation with my father exacerbated that. So it was just a very chaotic upbringing. But at the same time, it was really sports that were not only an outlet, but the coaches that I dealt with that were really the mentors that helped push me through a lot of this, whether it was coming to pick me up, take me to practice, or really just starting to lift weights, all those things. I just had some great coaches that really helped guide me. And I never really had any problems with school. It was a primary focus of mine, and my mother was a big part of that. But the coaches made sure that as things got more chaotic with recruiting starting and things like that, that they sheltered me from a lot of the attention and a lot of the distractions that can come with that. So I always had really good people in my life, whether it was a coach or just other families. And I think that people that are dealing with situations like that, there are people in the community that can help them. And I think it's important for people that see those warning signs, that know that families are going through troubles like that they do whatever they can to help the children involved, because young people, you just don't understand what's going on. And even if you did understand, it's not like you know what to do. And sometimes you just need somebody to be there, somebody to listen, and somebody to care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do feel that's probably the biggest challenge for a lot of coaches is, while many are so good at mentoring and role modeling, and sometimes when you run into situations, regardless of what it is, sometimes they don't necessarily know how to handle it. And so there becomes this process and this importance of educating coaches and also other people within the school system about how to really appropriately help kids, regardless of what it is. If their parents are, struggling with mental health issues, crime, violence, background, any of that stuff. So I know that both of your parents, and thank you for sharing that about your background. And I've said in so many other interviews, I really like diving into the past, because I think our childhood shapes so much of who we become as adults or who we don't become as adults. So I know that both of your parents, you mentioned that they both struggled with addiction. And I'm curious, like, what did that look like as a child? If you could just paint the picture for people that aren't aware of those circumstances.
Well, I mean, with my father, it was much different. It was, whether it was smoking marijuana in the house or actually injecting drugs in the house, that it was, and as a child, you don't even know what that is. Mm-hmm. Like, there were times, where I would walk in the bathroom and, see the remnants of with drug paraphernalia and really not understand and just not really know what that was. And, I to the best of my recollection, my mother would just say that your father had some health issues or has some health issues, and he was disabled to work before I was born. So I knew that he was having some troubles, and he was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic, so he never worked and was on disability. And the story from that angle, I guess, made sense. Like, okay, so there's something going on, and he needs to take this, but he would just become violent and angry. and take things from the house or become abusive with my mother. And those things are just, it's just so scarring. And it's just so difficult to see, when you're 8, 9 years old, to see something like this. There's just this useless anger. Like, what am I going to do? I mean, there's nothing you can do. You can't stop him. I mean, and to have him, later on, threaten us physically and threaten to kill us, things like that. It was very chaotic. And there were a number of times that he was put into rehabs or he was in jail, and my mother again would do the best that she could. But then there were times when, and we didn't see her. We never saw her use anything. And she was a registered nurse, and it's can be really difficult when you have a problem with pills. And she was apparently using pills, taking pills from the hospitals, and she would have to go off to rehab, and we'd have to stay with another family sometimes for extended periods of time. And actually, when I got into high school, she lost her nursing license because she had been taking those pills. So she was suspended, lost her license for a time, but then and she did whatever she could. I remember she worked at a gas station, and when you're a kid, it's like, it's kind of embarrassing. Like, oh wow, your mother's working at the gas station now. But you know what? She was doing whatever she could to try and get money to help us. And she ended up getting her license back and started back to become a nurse. And for a time, I went and lived with a guardian. So there was a time in high school when I wasn't even living at home. And but she did what she needed to do to get herself back and get back to work. And I went back and lived with her through my senior year.
Wow, that must have been a lot to handle. Just a lot of, you say, chaos. But I also feel like that word is a light description for what it was, because there's a lot of, I mean, somebody could describe it as even traumatic at some points, a lot of instability. But I'm curious, you've had the conversation about how genetics play a role in addiction. And it's also been proven that environment and context and life events and triggers will also push somebody over the edge. So in your experience and with your dynamic, how do you think all those things have played a role, not only in your situation, but also your parents as well?
Well, it's hard to say with my father. Again, he wasn't working. And I don't really know the history of addiction in his family. And I think that you talk about addiction, but you talk about other mental illnesses. And I think that especially for somebody that was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic, some of it may have been self-medication. I know that when his mother died in around 82, that was when his problem became much worse. And that's when he was involved with the shooting where he ended up going to jail. So I know that at least was a part of the issue with him. Now, my mother trying to deal with him, but I know that there was a history in her family anyway. So that was a part of it. But I'm not a doctor. As much as I've studied some of it, I can't put all of the pieces together and say, yes, this was definitively it. And then when it was me, when I was in high school, and I drank a couple of times in high school, and like the second time I drank, it was just really bad, and had a really bad experience, and said, look, I know I shouldn't have been drinking anyway, looking at my mother and my father and what happened with them, but I thought I would try it anyway. But after that, I didn't drink at all until I got into college, and then it just kind of took off. But when you're young and you can recover, and you can be out all night and still get up the next day, it's a little bit easier. But they talk about alcoholism and other addictions being progressive in bad sense. And as you get older, it becomes harder to recover. And I think the craving becomes stronger, especially when you're not using. And I think that that can make the problem worse. And so you go on these long stretches where you're using, and it becomes harder and harder to recover, and harder to function normally. And that's a difficult part about it.
It is almost amazing that you were exposed to so much as a child and exposed to so many different substances, and yet you didn't really experiment with anything or even try alcohol until high school. And even then, it was only a couple times. Like, how were you able to stay away from all of that?
Well, I think it was more of a fear of, kind of what I saw. I didn't want to become my father. That was, and that was probably, it really was, thinking about the birth of my son in 2012, that I just saw myself becoming my father. And when I was in high school, all those memories were still fresh. And then, what happens, I think, to people that have a history of it and probably know that they themselves have a genetic predisposition, is that they think that they can be smarter than their disease. And that's the biggest part. I think that's the most difficult part, is that you believe that you can use and you can get away with it. And even if some early experimentation leads you to believe that, maybe you can get away with it again, it moves down a path where it becomes harder and harder to recover. And again, it's what you really want to be. And to be the best parent that I could be, I couldn't have alcohol in my life. It was pretty simple. It was a glaring reality.
So where did sports come into play during your childhood? At what age did it enter your life?
So I was in the 5th grade. So I was just about 10 when I started to run track. Track was always my first love, and just watching watching track in the Olympics. Just like always a goal of mine. Like in watching Carl Lewis in 1984 win 4 gold medals, like I wanted to break the world record in the long jump. So that's what I really wanted to do. And the track coach, when I was in the 5th grade at this Catholic school, his friend was the football coach. And so after the track season in my 5th grade year, I started playing football in the 6th grade. But football, to me at that time, it was just kind of something to do in the off season of track as I was preparing. So I really didn't see it as something. And it's kind of funny, when I was in the 6th grade, I remember a friend of mine, his father said, you're going to be playing professional football one day. And I was like, whatever. Like I never thought that it would be a career, that I'd actually end up playing professional football. And it was, probably it was about 10 years from the first time that I played there in the 6th grade to getting drafted when I was 21.
That parent said that to you when you were how old?
I was 11.
And he said that to you when you were 11?
Yeah, but I think parents probably say, friends, parents' friends, or friends' parents say things like that, probably just, wow, you look really good. But yeah, he said that when I was 11.
Wow.
Ended up being right.
That's amazing. No, but clearly you were very talented as an athlete from a very young age. And clearly becoming a parent now, parents don't just offer up that type of information. If anything, they're more critical of kids. It's like, nah, he doesn't have it, or she doesn't have it, So for a parent to say that to a child at 11 years old, you must have really been something. So I know you became the first player to win Ohio's Mr. Football Award twice, even though your first love was really track. So at what point did you realize that, hey, whatever that parent said when I was 11 years old, hey, this is really real? At what point, maybe during high school or middle school, did you realize, hey, I might be pretty good at one of these things?
Well, I knew I was good. Even when I first started running track, like they had, I would run an AAU track, so they would have national rankings So you could see the national rankings, and I was right up there in the national rankings. So track is much more objective. I mean, you've got times to be able to compare. And then when I got into high school, I had some of the fastest times in the country. So it was like, yeah, I mean, I knew that I was good at track, but it was my sophomore year in football that I realized that, I was pretty good at football because I played varsity that year. And the first game that I played in, I didn't really play much in the first half, and they put me in the second half and ended up tying the game and then winning the game in overtime. It was like, some corny movie. And at that point, I started to get the letters from different schools about football. I'd already started receiving letters about track in my sophomore year. But I started to receive the letters about football. And it was like, yeah, that's when it really started to hit home. But even when I got to Ohio State, like I remember the freshmen would show up a couple of days early and we'd practice without the upperclassmen. And when the upperclassmen got there and I saw practice for the first time at Ohio State, I was like, I literally thought, like, I'm going to be the biggest flop in college football.
You had imposter syndrome?
There's no way that I can be that violent and withstand that level of violence. And it passed quickly, but it was striking to me. And then when I started to play, and it's kind of funny, the first college game ended up looking like the first high school game. It was against Texas Tech, and in the first half, really didn't play. And in the second half, came in the game, made some big plays, scored a touchdown, threw up on national TV. Brent Musburger was calling the game. It was pretty
Fantastic.
Cool. We ended up winning the game, and I went on to become, freshman of the year and all that kind of stuff. It was just it was another storybook kind of situation. But it was really when I started to perform like that at Ohio State that the reality of possibility of professional football really sank into me.
Well, what I didn't know about your journey is that you actually flopped back and forth a little bit between football and track, right? Because you played 2 years of football at Ohio State, and in between, you actually took a track scholarship and during your sophomore year. Is that right?
Yeah, it is. And so what ended up happening when I was in my sophomore year at Ohio State, or just about to enter my sophomore year, they brought in a new coach as the offensive coordinator, and this guy just hated me, absolutely hated me. He just thought they were too soft on me, and that I remember him coming in like during the spring practices, and he's like, "That guy takes class too seriously." Like, why are you saying something? Yeah. And it's funny. There's a coach. I don't want to bring up his name, but there's a coach that was he was a head coach in college, and he said that he was on his staff and he was the same way with him. But anyway, this coach over the summer, I had to take a chemistry class, and when camp started, the class was still going, and it was a chemistry with the lab, and sometimes with the lab, I would have to miss practice. They had 3-a-day practices back then, so it was really
wow.
Great. But I would miss one of the practices, and the guy came up to me in the locker room, and he's like, at least one of these days next week, I need you here at practice instead of class. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, you can't. I was so stunned that something like that was even said to me, and I ended up leaving the team. And at the time, I was just so angry and hurt. I really should have just gone to the coach and said, "Look, the guy told me to miss a class. This is BS." But when you're that age and you're really angry and and confused, you don't really know what to do. I left the team, and it was a big national story. And, there was all this controversy around it, and I didn't want to come back to the team and be a distraction at that point. So I thought of transferring. And so I went to USC, which was my second choice. Coming out of high school, I went to USC again, but I also went to Stanford. And I was thinking about transferring. And you know what the rule has just changed now here in the last couple of weeks, couple of months, that you can transfer without any penalty. But back then, I was thinking about transferring in the fall of my sophomore year. But even if I transferred then, I wouldn't have enrolled in time to be eligible the next year because summer classes don't count for eligibility purposes. So even if I took winter and summer at Stanford or USC, I wouldn't have been able to transfer. So I ended up sitting out and running track that year. But we can get to this part of the story later. But at Stanford at the time, Denny Green was the coach. So he was the head coach, and Ty Willingham, his running back coach, ended up going to the league with him, and of course ended up coaching at Stanford and at Washington himself. But that's how I met Denny. So I met Denny when I was thinking about transferring from Ohio State. But in that off season, I transferred to a track scholarship, trained with the track team that entire fall, and then ended up running that entire spring at Ohio State. And that was the spring of '92. 400 meters was my race. And I actually ended up qualifying for the Olympic trials in the 400 that spring. But now
unbelievable.
Now I look back at it and I'm like, I should have gone to the trials, just gone. I knew I wouldn't have qualified. I know the difference. Unlike DK Metcalf, I know the difference between speed and football speed. And even as a world-class 400-meter runner, I wasn't fast enough to make the U.S. team. So I ended up making the decision to go back and play football at Ohio State. And so I just concentrated on football and getting back to go play football that season, and didn't end up going to the trials. But I ended up running in '93 as well. So after I turned pro in football, I still ran track that spring. So after I got drafted in '93, we actually won the NCAA 4x400.
Oh, man. Oh, my gosh. So many parts I want to ask about. The fact that you qualified for the Olympic trials and then you didn't go. But that's just amazing.
But it was a cool letter. I don't know where the letter is anymore, but you got the invitation because I qualified. The time was fast enough to qualify automatically. I didn't have to wait for seedings.
Wow. That's really amazing. I also find it admirable and amazing that you were able to put academics and class and your studies first. Even when you get the pressure from a coach, like, hey, you need to be at practice, because even I came from an upbringing where it's like academics is first over everything else. But even then, had a coach come to me and said, hey, I need you to be at practice because I'm such a coach and people pleaser, and you're doing everything you can, right? As a student athlete, because it's like you want to prove yourself. So I don't know if I would have had the gumption to say no to a coach. So where did that come from, where you knew that you had to put your academics before sport?
Well, growing up, as I said, my mother was a registered nurse, and I had always been fascinated with science in particular, especially being around hospitals and seeing what she did. And I always knew and was especially encouraged by her to excel in school. And quite frankly, as I said, I didn't really think about turning pro or thinking about the real possibility of turning professional in football until I got to college. Even then, I knew the nature of the sport. I'd broken my arm in the 8th grade, broken my arm in the 9th grade, and was, I was almost at a point where I wasn't even going to play anymore. But I always knew that the nature of the sport was that no matter how good you are at football, it can end at any day. So what are you going to do then? And that's, it was something. And again, I thank my mother and I thank my coaches for always impressing that on me as well, because it was always, football is great. and you're really good at it and you may be pro one day, but your pro career could end literally on any snap, period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no question about that. So you say you're at Ohio State for 3 years. You get selected in the first round in 1993 in the NFL draft. So what's happening behind the scenes with regards to your social life, the personal issues, the evolution with your relationship with alcohol? Because I know you mentioned that you'd only really drank a couple times in high school. And then what was that like in college?
So, I mean, there were some wild nights, some crazy nights, and certainly affected my grades when I started drinking. But again, when you're younger, you can handle things like that. And at that point, the incidents where it really got out of control were just they were so far apart that it really didn't become an alarm at that point. So it really wasn't that bad. And, when I turned pro, Denny was one of those coaches that was very flexible. And in the off season, I would go back and take classes at Ohio State. So I was still working on my degree at that point. Because, it's funny when I first was getting ready to go to Ohio State, a doctor, who was kind of like an academic advisor in a sense, like not my true academic advisor, but advised me going into college, said, you should major in a humanity and not a science, because the medical schools are looking for more well-rounded students. And so I majored in history and ended up really on a chemistry minor path. So I had to take all the biology, chemistry, and physics, but also had to take all of the history classes. So,
oh my gosh.
While I was still at Ohio State, I finished up all of my pre-med requirements. So I was still on the right path, and I'm looking for I'm on the 22-year or 32-year plan. So I still have one class of German and one class of history to take. They changed the requirements when I left.
They keep adding more classes, don't they?
They went from the quarter system to the semester system, and in I think it was 2011 or 2012, I took one of each. So I still have to take the other ones, and we can talk about the entrepreneur path and kind of how that's distracted from it, but hopefully I'm at a place now where I can actually finish up those last two classes.
That's great. So you have 2 classes left.
Yeah.
Okay.
Literally
are you going to walk
classes.
down the aisle?
No. It's not my thing.
I was going to say, you have to let us know so that way we can catch this, or we can at least
I'll show the degree to the kids though.
Yes, that would be great. Yeah, I think, when you're talking about the socialization aspect and like the relationship with alcohol, I think the tough thing is about that, especially when you're in, whether it's high school or college or in your 20s while you're in the pros, is that that's just a part of the culture, right? Going out and partying. So it's easy, because I've had actually a couple friends. One of them was a high school friend, and she was an athlete, also a tennis player, and she has since passed. And another one who is another high profile athlete, which I won't name, but he used to drink so excessively to the point where he would black out. But it was so encouraged, because it was kind of like a badge of honor. You know what I mean? Right? So you understand, it's like, so if you're playing beer pong, you're doing it till 5 a.m., you come back from a game, you go all night, you go to practice. That's just like the thing that you do. So I feel like even if there are red flags emerging to the surface, no one really cares, or no one is really mature enough to acknowledge it, because it's just ingrained in the culture.
You're absolutely right. And it looks fairly normal. The drinking pattern looks fairly normal. The way that an alcoholic drinks in their 30s and 40s is, kind of like a college student and just out having a good time. But then, it becomes darker, drinking on your own and things like that. But in college, you just look like one of the boys. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And you're absolutely right. Like, I remember the nights being out with the team when I was in college, and then in the pros. And in the pros, you're out, you're drinking, you're socializing, you're womanizing, you're doing all those kind of things, and you're just one of the guys. So that pattern of behavior doesn't look so unusual.
Mm-hmm. So when you're in the NFL, I think a lot of people are just kind of wondering, and a lot of the general public or people that aren't aware might be in awe that anybody or any athlete is able to juggle all those things. But just kind of like how you mentioned that even when you're young, that you're able to juggle all this stuff and come to practice with a fresh face and everything. But we're also talking about some of the most gifted athletes in the world, and gifted athletes can go out and party and take whatever substance until 5 a.m. on 1 hour of sleep and show up and look perfectly fine and even have one of the best performances. But I know that you were very methodical with your process when you were in the NFL. So what did that look like?
Well, so I would choose certain days to drink. That's the way it would look for me. So, sometimes on a Thursday night, I might go out, with a game on a Sunday. And then on Sunday and Monday night, I would go out. But those were the only 3 days. And so I chose to drink on nights where I didn't have to do anything heavy the next day. And, towards the end of the week, just preparing for the game, I would never go out on a Friday night and just really try and mind the schedule that way. And, I was fortunate. That I didn't hurt myself or anybody else during those times because, pre-Uber days, everybody was out and drinking and carrying on. And a lot of times we would get hotels, but sometimes we wouldn't, just would drive in that condition, which really is just unthinkable really now.
Mm-hmm. So how did things change once football was no longer in your life? You spent 8 years in the NFL, and then what did that look like once you retired?
Yeah, and that I think that was really a turning point for me because you lose that structure, and I think part of it is losing identity as well. But you lose that structure. More importantly, when you don't have to do anything, that's oftentimes what you end up doing. You don't do anything, and businesses, unless you're involved in the day-to-day of a business and never got to that point at that time, the using and drinking like that just becomes part of the routine. And once that routine and that habit gets formed, then it just becomes really difficult to break that cycle. And that's exactly what ended up happening to me. Now, for a number of years, I didn't work. So I didn't work until 2005, which was a little more than 4 years after retiring from football. So I was at I started at ESPN in 2005, and it was the same kind of pattern where you just try and control the drinking. Don't drink when you're working, and then try and manage it when you're away. But it got to the point, especially after the birth of my daughter, and then before the birth of my son. It just got to a point where it's like I just can't do this anymore.
Mm-hmm. I think the thing that is intriguing about your journey is that I think there might be the misconception that addiction with any substance is every day, all day, every day. And it's there's this uncontrollable nature about it. But with your situation, it was very systematic and yet very controlled. And whenever you let go, you would get, there was that element of not being in control, but how you approached it, you're like, okay, these days I'm focused. And then the other days I'm going to let loose.
Yeah, and that's the mistake that I think a lot of people make in evaluating their addiction or their use patterns. Is that I'm not drinking every day, so I can't be an alcoholic. And you really have to think about you really need to be ruthlessly honest with yourself and look at the way that it is that you drink when you do drink? And do you feel like you can control it when you're doing it? And the problems that arise when you do it, and then you have these binges, like that's problem drinking. And you look at the lists for addiction, and what that pattern looks like, and you start checking all the boxes. And if you're honest with yourself, and you see that yes, those things apply to me, then again, it's not only do you fit the pattern of an alcoholic or an addict, it's are you able to do the things that you really want to do with your life every day? Not just when you want to do them, but can you do those things every day? And being a parent isn't a sometimes thing. It's an everyday thing. And not everybody's a parent. Not everybody faces that decision. But thankfully for me, that was part of the equation, because it made it simpler to do the analysis and say, if I want to be this parent, then I can't have this in my life.
Yeah. Yeah, I think being a parent certainly changes everything. You always hear that cliche. Once you have kids, you'll be forever changed, and you have a completely different perspective on life. And you hear it, and you're like, okay, I get it. It's the same thing. I've heard this over and over again. And then when you become a parent, once I became a parent, I was like, oh, this is what it's really like, and it's transformative. So the 2 points I think that I'm so fascinated with, I think that were pivotal moments in your journey, was that turning point, also the breaking point for you when you're like, this isn't working and I really have to do something. And also the other point is when you became public about your story. So with the first part, when was the breaking point, would you say?
It was right before the birth of my son. And again, I think I never drank around my daughter, but before the birth of my son, I had a binge and was thinking like, I just can't do this. I'm literally becoming my father. And that really was the point that really hit home to me. If I'm going to be the father of my son the way that I need to be, then I can't have alcohol.
Mm-hmm. You had been sober for a number of years before you relapsed. And when you look back at that moment, are you able to identify certain triggers or something that might have allowed you to set it off? Or was it just happenstance? It just kind of happened?
Well, I think periods of sobriety kind of convince an addict or an alcoholic that they have control, and that this time it's going to be okay. And I think that's really what kind of happens. Like, well, I'm feeling a lot better now, so I can go back and give this another try. And that, that's a pattern that a lot of addicts and alcoholics see. It doesn't matter how much sobriety you have. It can, it all ends with one drink or one use, and that's just the way that your mind works, and that you want to go back to it. And so you're looking for any reason to excuse your past and say, yeah, well, this time it's going to be different.
Mm-hmm. So what did that help look like for you? How were you able to pull yourself out of that? I think this is really important information, because I think, I've said it again and again, and I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but I just think that athletes are really good in terms of being coachable, and they're good for asking for help from their coaches and from their peers. But when it comes to personal issues, we can oftentimes be stubborn. So what did that help look like for you?
Well, it's finding somebody that's been through it. It's finding other people that have the same issues. And that's, there are a number of different organizations out there that have resources like that. There are hospitals and other facilities that are set up for it. And I think that's important for anybody seeking help. Understand that the best person or the best people to help you deal with addiction are addicts, former addicts. They're the ones that have been through the same things, that have talk themselves into the same patterns of thinking and behavior. And so those are the people that you seek out. And again, the resources are available. It's just admitting that you have a problem is the first step. But then going and seeking the people that know the path is the next.
Mm-hmm. Did you do individual counseling and or group counseling?
I did. I did do both.
Okay. Yeah. Part of our training last summer, especially with my group counseling course, we have to kind of dip our toes in a lot of different experiences. And I chose an AA meeting to attend as just kind of like an observer. And it was really empowering. I mean, you had so many, I think what was interesting, even more interesting about it was during the pandemic, that allowed Zoom to become an integral part of the mental health space, which is great. So just this one AA meeting, you had about 60 people. I mean, people were calling in from South Africa, Europe, like Alaska, Louisiana. For some people, it was their 10th year of sobriety. For other people, it was their first day and they had relapsed 5 days in a row and they were calling in from a hotel and had just lost their job. I mean, just the span of experiences was so powerful. And I know that there's different experiences too. So, I think that was really interesting and powerful to see. And I think it's important to talk about that because I think that help comes in so many different shapes and sizes, and there's no one way to get help. I think it's all about figuring out what system works for you. Would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think, to your point, people need to understand that there's help there, and and even if there wasn't Zoom, you can pick up a phone. It's just convincing people that you don't want to try and do that alone. And I think just the psychology of it is that you aren't alone. The phrase that I've heard used is "Don't believe that you're terminally unique." That there are other people that have gone through similar problems and have tried to deal with them in the wrong, similar ways. And so when you go and you seek that help, you can just pick up the phone. And again, it goes back to what we talked about earlier, that cue, habit, reward cycle. The cue, like you want to pick up a drink, pick up the phone, call somebody, jump into one of these Zoom meetings, because you're right. They're going on all over the world all the time. And so people can jump in at any time and just understand that there's somebody there and there's somebody that cares about what you're going through, and not feeling that emptiness, that loneliness that really kind of pushes people into that area of darkness. You can get into one of those meetings at any time.
Along your journey, you talk about that void or that emptiness, that darkness. Have you been able to figure out or identify the moments where that might be a trigger for you, and how do you deal with that?
I think a lot of it has to do with memories, especially from being a child and looking back at those times. Now, unfortunately, I've lost my mother and my brother, and kind of dealing with that, or dealing with those losses, dealing with any loss. There's a grieving process that you really just have to acknowledge, and you acknowledge when those triggers come. What is it that you try and do? I think you try and look at the positive aspects. Yes, I had this trauma going on, this chaos as a child, but I had so many people that cared so much about me, that weren't even family, that just wanted to help. And that's amazing. Like and there are people like that in every community, people that want to help other people. And I think it's important for any individual struggling to understand there are resources. So there are things that you can do to go get that help. So when those triggers come in that way, you look for a different outlet. You look for a different way to deal with it. And for me, really thinking about all of the positive, and dealing with the loss of a loved one is the same way. Rather than thinking about the end and the grief especially right when you lose somebody, you think about all the great times that you have and how it's the path that we all go on. It's the one thing about the human condition that we all share. We're all going to die. We're all going to die at some point. It's a short life, and it's also a beautiful life if you appreciate the people and the things that you have in your life. So when you think about those loved ones that you lost, you think about all those great times that you shared, because you had a lot more great times together that really, in balance, are more of the experience that you had with them than it is the loss that you felt at the end.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you've been able to come to grips with how to manage all of that stuff, how to allow yourself to heal and to grieve. And then there's this shift in perspective about like, hey, rather than focusing on just that negative stuff, I'm going to shift my perspective and remember the good stuff as well. But there's also that process of having to heal and giving yourself time to grieve as well.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. That you brought that up, that you have to acknowledge your own humanity. You have to understand that there is a process, and that there are those steps that you go through, and it's okay to be sad sometimes. That's who we are. And if you've loved, you felt pain in that relationship many times, right? So understanding that that's part of it, but then trying to focus on more of the positive aspects. That's what really brings you back to the best aspects of that relationship.
Mm-hmm. So here you are on the process of healing and dealing with these issues and getting help. And how long was it from the moment you started to really work on yourself and get help to the moment you came out publicly about your story in 2013?
I think it must have been about a year and a half or so.
Okay.
And it was seeing Chris Carter talk about it at the Hall of Fame induction in 2013 that triggered it for me, because it was like, why keep this to myself when, notoriety in and of itself isn't really good for anything, other than, making you feel good, I guess, in some way, or, maybe bigger paychecks. But if you can do something with notoriety, if you can actually help somebody or change something, then you're really moving into a different level. And for me, it was the ability to help so many other people out there. And, having people come up to me at a gas station or something like that and say, "Hey, I heard your story and it really helped me." Like, that's great. And, it doesn't have to be an addict or an alcoholic. I think the good thing that we've seen here, not just in the pandemic, but I think over the last couple of years in general, is that people are just more honest, or at least more open to sharing those types of stories and issues, whether it's gender-related, sexuality, addiction, mental health. We're talking more about these things, and that's the good part of the cesspool or what can be the cesspool of social media.
Yeah, it can be a cesspool. There's no question about it, but there are the positive aspects of it. And you're right. I think technology and social media has allowed people a platform to be much more transparent and have control over their story and their narrative. And I think that's definitely the positive aspects of that. So when you come out in 2013, what was that experience like, coming out for the first time and sharing that publicly?
It definitely was a relief. Like, it was the easing of a burden, being able to do that and just kind of be open with people. And there's just this relief. Like, you don't have to carry the world. You feel like there's this big dark secret, and it makes you less open in general, I think. And so opening up that way really just kind of was the release of a burden. It's an empowering feeling, but more than anything else, it's understanding or revealing that vulnerability. It can be very cleansing.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that as well. I think there's a process, and I'm curious. This was my own personal experience, at least with it, with my mental health issues and my eating disorder related to that was very much tied to sport. But there's this process of shame and embarrassment and wanting to hide it for a number of years. But then as I got help and I was able to work through my story and heal and understand myself a little bit more, then you get to this point where it's like, my gosh, as you said, I have this big secret, and you want to live this life of authenticity. And I think a part of that is like, this is my story. And if I don't take control of it and share it, it's just going to control me. So you just kind of want to, doesn't it feel that way? I'm curious if that's what you felt as well.
Yeah. It's liberating.
Yeah.
You feel that you're imprisoned by your own mind, by your own deceit. And it can be a real drag on you. And it's, it kind of can take over all aspects of your life. And I think that in general, you just become a happier person because you're not feeling the need to hide those things. Mm-hmm. And it helps you, I think, come to terms with who you are in a very general sense as well. And I think the more we see who we are, the more we're aware of all of those different aspects of our being, the quicker we are really to see warning signs. And the more truthful we are about that, the easier it is to avoid moving into those dark places because of those different issues.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm catching you at a really good time because we're just several days away from the 9th anniversary of your sobriety. If my math is right, math has never been really my forte, but I think that's right, right? Okay. So what does it feel like as you approach your 9th anniversary?
I honestly, I don't even think about it like that anymore. I think about it as just, I'm on the same day. I'm on the same day as everybody else that is either sober or trying to get sober. We're all in the same boat. So I don't even think about it in those terms anymore.
Do you not give yourself credit and take a time to celebrate yourself a little bit?
Yeah, I do some of that, but the further you get, the less you really are concerned about that. It's really about just trying to live each day, moment to moment, and really appreciating every day and not falling into, because I think what happens to a lot of people is and that's why I'm hesitant sometimes, I've got this much and I've got that much time. We're all on the same 24.
Yeah.
We're all on the same 24. And people that hear long periods of sobriety, sometimes they get intimidated and say, there's no way I can make it to, 9 or 20 or 30. You don't have to do that. You said you have to stay sober today.
Yeah. It's just little steps.
Yeah.
Right.
That's why, it's a phrase often used, one day at a time. That's what it is. You know what? If it has to be a minute at a time, do it that way. That's what you get told by people that have long periods of sobriety. You don't have to do it 9 years at a time, or 10 years at a time. You have to do it one day at a time. Everybody does the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Well, as we're kind of wrapping up this conversation, I don't think our conversation necessarily has to center around the topic of addiction. I think this is applicable to anything, but people that are going through their own issues, especially if we're talking to athletes, if we're talking to the athlete population, or if we're even talking to sports parents or coaches, what kind of advice would you have for them if they were to hear your story and they were experiencing similar things? What kind of advice would you have for them?
Just be brutally honest. Be brutally honest and understand that what it is that you're trying to be can be impacted by all of those other aspects of your mental health. And you can't be the best version of yourself and have all of that baggage without dealing with it. If you're, and we see it so many times in sports that, a lot of people are talented, but a lot of people don't make it because there's some aspect of their mental makeup that doesn't allow them to achieve what they need to achieve, especially when you're talking about sports, like golf that are so mental. There are so many players that don't achieve the highest level, but in any sport, because if you don't have the right mindset, if you can't deal with occasional failures, if you can't deal with needing to be able to push yourself harder, then you can't be the best that you want to be at something. And if we all want to be the best version of ourselves, whatever it is that we do in life, then we have to evaluate. If we want to be the best version of ourselves, we need to evaluate what steps we need to take to achieve that. And always, and I always tell this to my kids, it always starts with attitude. It always starts with mindset. Because if you haven't set a path, or I should say an end goal for what it is that you want to be, then you don't know where you're going and you're lost. Once you kind of set that goal for where you want to be, athletically, physically, spiritually, mentally, all of that, then you can do the individual steps that help you achieve that.
I love what you said about the goal. I also love what you said about just being totally brutally honest with ourselves. I think that's one of the hardest things to do as an adult. And I think that's applicable, not to just whether it's mental health, relationships, the relationship we have with ourselves, the relationship we have with others, facing the truth. I feel like as you get older, becomes a lot harder to do because oftentimes the truth hurts, but I also think that the truth allows us to evolve and grow and to hopefully achieve a better life. But Robert, thank you so much for coming on the show and allowing me to investigate and explore and pepper you with all sorts of crazy personal questions. But I think your story is just so inspiring, and I've known about it. I've yet to, before this interview, I yet to talk to you about it personally. And it really is. It's such an inspiring story. So I appreciate you coming on and just being so vulnerable and sharing it with us.
You got it. Great to connect with you again, Prim.
Great to connect with you.
The next chapter with Prim Siripipat is a production of iHeartRadio.